there is any debt trap, it's the responsibility of those nations in Africa who have mismanaged their economies. You can't go back and blame China for any mishap. If you are planning an economy, if you have resources to mobilize, if you have goals to achieve in any area or in any sector, definitely you have to have the correct policies, and you have to have the institutional mechanism to implement this. China would be willing to support and help, allow governments to borrow money, but ultimately the management issue falls on the responsibility of the African side. Blaming China for debt traps is simply defaming the achievements and probably trying to create some rift between African and Chinese contributions in the solidarity that has achieved the economic development we see today. One of the worrying things for these hegemonistic forces globally is China working with Africa to extricate Africa from the marginalization that it exists today and move forward in solidarity with the peoples of Africa. If there are mistakes done by African government, debt traps will have to be managed by learning from mistakes and correcting the handling of the economies that have failed into this trap.
China are invested into modern infrastructure. And when you build airports, roads, railways, hospitals, power grids, and schools, all of these assets go directly into improving the productivity of a nation. It's an investment into giving the future generation a chance at a better life. And it's also a smart loan strategy from China. When you are investing in something that improves productivity, you most certainly are increasing the chances of being paid back on that debt. On the flip side, loans that are offered from America are typically given in emergency situations to cover trade and fiscal deficits. While these Western loans are certainly needed and provide a short-term solution to a complex problem, the money is spent immediately. It doesn't resolve the core issue, and it most definitely won't prevent it from happening again. Much of Africa's infrastructure was inherited from the colonial era, but the lack of modern roads, power networks, clean water, modern schools, all of this has hampered Africa's economic development for years. A study by the UK government-sponsored Commission for Africa estimated that transportation bottlenecks and inefficiencies amount to an 80% export tax on Ugandan textiles. Without better electricity and clean water, how can these factories in Uganda produce quality products? Without roads and ports, how can these Uganda factories ship their products around the world? Without basic infrastructure, it's now more difficult to attract investment into the sector, and ultimately, all of these challenges will hinder job creation. It's very easy to see why closing this infrastructure gap is the biggest priority for the future of Africa. For decades, weak planning, poor leadership, corruption, and a lack of regional cooperation amongst African countries hindered the continent's ability to improve. However, things changed when China integrated many African nations into the Belt and Road Initiative. From 2000 to 2020, China has helped African countries build more than 13,000 kilometers of roads and railway, 80 large-scale power facilities, 130 medical facilities, 45 sport venues, and over 200 schools. It was a big moment in Kenya's history when passengers boarded the Madaraka Express, which connects Kenya's capital and its main port of Mombasa. At a cost of $3.6 billion, this rail line represents the most expensive infrastructure project in Kenya's history. It was built by the China Road and Bridge Corporation, who hired over 25,000 Kenyan workers to work on the railway. Another win for Kenya. The rail line exceeded expectations and passed 2 million passengers in the first 17 months of operation, prompting Kenya's Daily Nation newspaper to write, "China is a worthy partner in its efforts to break the age-old poverty trap based on centuries of underdevelopment." A recent survey conducted by the Afrobarometer of 34 African countries from 2019 to 2020 found that while some were concerned about being heavily indebted to China, 63% of Africans view China as a positive external influence on the continent. This compares to 60% for the United States and 57% for the United Nations. But honestly, we can't discuss China's efforts in Africa without bringing in a true expert on the situation. and I would like everybody to meet Deborah Brautigam, the author of The Dragon's Gift, The Real Story of China in Africa. Deborah and her colleague wrote this article for The Atlantic entitled The Chinese Debt Trap is a Myth, claiming that the narrative wrongfully portrays both Beijing and the developing countries it deals with. In this article, Deborah goes on to state, our research shows that Chinese banks are willing to restructure the terms of existing loans and have never actually seized an asset from any country. The myth of debt trap diplomacy has been popularized by many Western politicians in an effort to combat the rise of China. Over the past 20 years, Chinese construction firms have learned a lot from their American and European counterparts. China now boasts 27 firms among the top 100 global contractors, up from just 9 in 2000. In contrast, the United States has only 7 contractors among the global top 100, down from 19 in 2000. This represents a 63% decline for America in just 2 decades. Over the past few weeks, I've made multiple videos on China's investments around the world. I've talked about China's efforts in Asia Pacific, Latin America, even China's efforts around the world. But it's important to highlight the truth of what China is doing in Africa. In the future, the country that offers loans for developing infrastructure is going to be the leader of the developing world. And one can argue that China is in a better position to deal with these smaller developing nations, because just 4 decades ago, China's economy was also small and just starting to develop. China can empathize with these countries' current position and can provide them the exact same playbook that helped China rise to become a global leader in the world.
Through U.S. instruments of soft power and economic power like the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, or the World Bank, these are dominated and basically controlled by the U.S. Only the U.S. has veto power over these institutions, which were created through the Bretton Woods system at the end of World War II. And they essentially act as tools of U.S. neocolonialism, economic influence, and they trap countries in debt. That is actual debt trap diplomacy. Now, on the other hand, if we look at what China is actually doing in its foreign policy, it is not debt trap diplomacy. China, unlike the US, has forgiven billions of dollars of loans. It has renegotiated tens of billions of dollars of loans. And what I'm going to be talking about today is the announcement made by the Chinese government on August 18th that it's going to be forgiving 23 loans for 17 African countries. I have a report about this over at multipolarista.com. I'll link to it in the description below. And it details China's plans to pardon interest-free loans, 23 interest-free loans for 17 African nations. And China is doing this, by the way, after it already canceled $3.4 billion worth of debt and restructured $15 billion worth of debt on the African continent from 2000 to 2019 in that 20-year period. So this is the exact opposite of debt trap diplomacy. And as I'll talk about later in this analysis, we even have mainstream academics at prestigious U.S. universities like Johns Hopkins University and Harvard Business School, which are by no means bastions of anti-imperialism. They're very right-wing institutions. Even they have reluctantly acknowledged through their research that China does not engage in debt trap diplomacy, and unlike the U.S., has forgiven and renegotiated many billions of dollars of loans in the global south as part of this strategy of what China refers to as South-South cooperation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about China's real diplomacy and real foreign policy. Again, this is all spelled out in greater detail at multipolarista.com, and I have a link to that article below in the description. The article is titled, China Forgives 23 Loans for 17 African Countries, Expands Win-Win Trade and Infrastructure Projects. And the Chinese mission to the United Nations tweeted a series of bullet points summarizing some of its main promises made to the African continent. And these were promises that were made on August 18th in a meeting that the Chinese Foreign Ministry and China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi held with leaders from the African continent and specifically from the African Union. This article detailed how Western corporate media outlets and governments have been absurdly trying to accuse China of so-called debt trap diplomacy in Sri Lanka, a country that had a bankruptcy recently. The government was defaulted on its debt, was unable to pay its debt. And the reality is that China is only the owner of 10% of Sri Lanka's foreign debt, whereas the over 80%, 81% of Sri Lanka's foreign debt is owned by Western banks and vulture funds, Western governments and financial institutions, Japan and India. So this is a clear example, once again, of the lie of debt trap diplomacy. And in this article, I cited an article that was published in the Atlantic magazine. This is the voice of the U.S. capitalist class. This is the voice of the Washington, D.C. establishment. The Atlantic has a complete neoliberal right-wing economic editorial policy, and its foreign policy line is extremely hawkish and neoconservative. The Atlantic is in no way progressive. It represents the centrist establishment of the U.S. ruling class in Washington and the big corporations and capitalist interests that drive them. But the Atlantic magazine admitted in this article, after the Atlantic magazine has published many articles falsely accusing China of debt trap diplomacy, but they were forced to admit in this article that was written by two very mainstream scholars, including Deborah Brautigam, who is at Johns Hopkins University. She's at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University, which is very close, by the way, to the US government and to intelligence agencies. She has done research on China's policies in Africa, and this article is also co-written by Meg Rithamore, who is a professor at Harvard Business School, which once again is a right-wing bastion of neoliberal economics funded by big corporations. But they acknowledged the fact in this article, The Atlantic, that is titled, "The Chinese Debt Trap is a Myth." They admitted that the US government narrative of China, so-called trapping countries in debt, is a myth. It's false. It's not true. US Vice President Mike Pence referred to it as debt trap diplomacy. Trump's Attorney General William Barr also said the same thing. We've seen that the Biden administration has also done the same. Joe Biden himself, Anthony Blinken, they spread these lies. And this article in the Atlantic magazine admits, quote, that debt trap narrative is a lie and a powerful one. They wrote, "Our research shows that Chinese banks are willing to restructure the terms of existing loans and have never actually seized an asset from any country." Between 2000 and 2019, China canceled more than $3.4 billion of debt in Africa, and China restructured or refinanced around $15 billion of debt in Africa, and Beijing renegotiated at least 26 individual loans. That is in addition to the 23 interest-free loans for 17 African countries that Beijing has just announced that it's going to pardon. So all this shows that the US claims and European claims of Chinese so-called debt trap diplomacy, the insanely ridiculous claims made by European colonialists who colonized Africa, that supposedly Africa is the new colonizer. It's ridiculous propaganda. It is hypocritical projection for the colonialist, imperialist, and neo-colonialist policies that the United States and European powers have carried out on the African continent for decades, for centuries, and they continue to carry out today. It is the European colonialist powers and the US that are responsible for mass enslavement of millions of Africans, of genocide in numerous African countries, of massive super exploitation of the African continent, of constant military interventions. The US, Europe, and NATO destroyed the most prosperous country on the African continent, Libya, in 2011 in a war of aggression. Western aggression against Africa does not cease. The US has US Special Operations Forces involved across the African continent in dozens of countries. AFRICOM, which by the way is based in Germany because no self-respecting sovereign African nation would host this US military command of AFRICOM, African Command, that is oppressing the continent. AFRICOM is active in the majority of the continent, and the US and Europe continue to exploit Africa while they project their own imperialist crimes onto China with conspiracy theories like the idea of debt trap diplomacy. It is very cynical, it is very racist, and it needs to be called out.
This video is a compilation of clip from CGTN, Cyrus Janssen, and Ben Norton on the subject of debt trap diplomacy. Here we will listen to Eritrean president on his opinion about the subject. Cyrus and Ben will also give their points and finding regarding the subject. For more information regarding this subject, links will be in the description. Thanks for watching the video, and please consider liking, sharing, commenting and subscribing to the channel. Thank you very much.